The sun cracked over the horizon like a silent promise, bleeding amber across the plains. Dust hung in the morning air, clinging to the long wooden fence that stretched across Elijah Kane's ranch like the spine of an old ghost. The land was silent, save for the wind whispering through brittle grass and the soft clink of the gate Elijah latched behind him. He moved slowly, not from age, but from the weight of memory. His boots scuffed across the hard-packed earth, each step deliberate, unhurried. The horses didn't lift their heads when he passed. They knew the rhythm of this man, the quiet rituals, the wordless tending. He fed them without affection, brushing them without thought, his mind someplace else. It had been that way for years. Inside the ranch house, the clock ticked in defiance of silence. The rooms were clean but hollow. No laughter, no scent of fresh bread, no trace of warmth. Just wood and stone and the faint echo of things long gone. A single photograph sat on the mantel, its frame dulled by time. A woman with fire in her eyes. A boy 6, maybe 7, missing a front tooth, but grinning like he owned the world. Elijah looked at it only once each morning, never more. He sat at the kitchen table with a tin cup of black coffee, staring out at the land he never left. This was his prison and his sanctuary. The fire had taken them both, his wife and his son, and with them it had taken his voice. Not his ability to speak, but the will to. Since then, he talked only to the animals and the dust. The townspeople called him the Ghost Rancher, a man whose name they remembered like a rumor. He went to town once a month, spoke only when pressed, and left no room for kindness. That morning, the cattle were restless. He noticed it as he walked the fence line, their snorts sharper, eyes uneasy. Something was off. A broken strand of wire confirmed it. A few head of cattle had likely strayed beyond the ridge. Elijah saddled his mare, a gray with more years than speed, and rode out toward the canyon trail that bordered the old trade path. It was a stretch he hadn't traveled in months, not since the spring floods. The trail was narrow, hemmed in by rock and thorn, with sharp outcroppings where vultures circled lazily overhead. The sun had climbed high by the time he reached the canyon's mouth. He dismounted and walked a stretch on foot, boots crunching on gravel, eyes sharp beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He saw the hoofprints. 3 or 4 cows headed southeast toward the edge of the Badlands. He swore under his breath he'd have to track them before the sun dipped low. But then something strange caught his eye, a shape just ahead, near the base of an old mesquite tree. It looked like cloth, torn, hanging, moving slightly in the breeze. He stepped closer, narrowing his gaze. It wasn't cloth, it was a girl. She was hanging by her arms, her wrists bound tightly with a cruel twist of barbed leather looped over a thick branch. Her feet didn't quite touch the ground, her body limp, swaying ever so slightly. Her head hung forward, tangled black hair hiding her face. Her clothes were rags, a dress shredded and stained with blood and dust. Elijah froze. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then, instincts buried deep in his bones stirred, and he moved. Fast! He dropped his rifle, ran to her, stood beneath her feet, and lifted her weight with one arm while sawing at the restraints with the hunting knife on his belt. The rope gave way, and she collapsed into his arms, light, far too light. He knelt with her, cradling her carefully. Her skin was hot, her lips dry and cracked, her breathing shallow. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, and across her forehead, scrawled in dried blood and jagged letters, were the words, "For sell." Elijah stared at the mark. His hands clenched before he forced them to still. He took off his coat, wrapped it around her, and carried her to his horse. She never opened her eyes. The ride back was slow and careful. He held her against him, shielding her from the sun, whispering words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Fragments of comfort, like dried leaves in the wind. The mare sensed the urgency and carried them home with steady resolve. At the ranch, he laid her on his bed. She barely stirred as he cleaned her wounds with warm water, washed the blood from her face, and carefully trimmed the remains of her ruined dress to treat the cuts beneath. When he wiped her forehead clean, the dried words smeared, but the memory would not. He sat beside her, his hands heavy in his lap, and stared for a long time. Something cracked in him, a thing he had buried for years. He didn't understand it yet, only that it hurt in a place he thought long dead. The sky turned to fire, and then to ash, as night fell over the ranch. Coyotes howled in the distance. Elijah sat beside her still, the old rifle leaning against the wall. He had seen many horrors in his life: war, death, fire, but nothing quite like this. A child treated like livestock, branded for sale. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he knew this: she would not die here. Not while he still drew breath. She stirred in her sleep, a whimper escaping her cracked lips. He touched her hand gently, as if afraid he might shatter her. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rasping like wind over gravel. It was the first thing he'd said to another soul in months. "You're safe." And for the first time in years, Elijah Kane prayed. Not to save himself, but to save her. Because somehow he knew she had saved him first. The girl didn't wake that night. Her chest rose and fell with shallow rhythm, but her mind remained lost in some far-off place that Elijah could not reach. He stayed by her side, sleeping upright in the old wooden chair by the bed, his fingers loosely wrapped around the rifle he hadn't let out of arm's reach. The night passed slowly, measured only by the creaking of the rafters and the occasional twitch of her limbs as though she were running through some terrible dream. Morning light bled through the slats of the window, warming the floorboards. Elijah stirred with a stiff groan and rubbed his eyes. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the house was cold. He rose, bones aching, and set to making coffee and oats. He kept his movements quiet, listening for even the slightest sound from the back room, but none came. Just the wind tapping gently on the glass. He returned to the girl and sat again, watching her small frame beneath the patchwork quilt. Her hands were scabbed, fingers curled in as if gripping something in sleep. She was still feverish, cheeks flushed with heat. Elijah dipped a cloth in the basin and wiped her forehead, careful around the bruises. She flinched at his touch, murmured something in a language he didn't know, then fell quiet again. By midday, she opened her eyes. They were dark, not with age, but with experience. Eyes that had seen things no child should see. She blinked slowly, gaze drifting from the rafters to the walls and finally to Elijah. The instant she saw him, her whole body tensed. She scrambled upright, gasping, and tried to push herself backward into the headboard. Her breathing turned ragged, hands grasping at invisible ropes, eyes darting for escape. Elijah stood slowly and held up both hands. "You're safe," he said. "Ain't nobody here but me." The words hung heavy in the room. She stared at him, chest heaving, too scared to speak but too tired to run. Elijah didn't move. He just stood there, tall and quiet, the same way he would with a spooked horse. After a long minute, she sagged back against the bedpost, her expression unreadable. He poured water from a jug into a tin cup and held it out. She didn't take it. "It's just water," he said softly. Her eyes flicked to the cup, then back to his face. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for it, her hand trembling. She drank with quick gulps, water spilling down her chin, then held the cup tight, as if afraid it would vanish. Elijah let her finish before speaking again. "You've been through hell, I can see that. Don't need to say a word yet. Just rest. You're safe now. This is my place. Name's Elijah." She didn't respond, only stared at him over the rim of the cup. That afternoon, she didn't eat the food he left on the table. She moved from the bed only when he wasn't looking, lingering by the doorway like a shadow, watching his every move as he swept the floor, chopped firewood, tended the horses. She kept her back to the walls, eyes alert, shoulders tense. When the sun began to set, she retreated to the room and lay back down, covering herself completely. Elijah said nothing. The second day passed much the same. She stayed silent, refused food, and flinched from touch. but her fever broke, and the color returned to her face. He made stew, placed it near the bed, and left her alone with it. When he returned hours later, the bowl was empty, cleaned with a finger and licked dry. On the third morning, he found her sitting on the porch step, wrapped in his old wool coat. Her bare feet touched the cold wood, and she stared out across the empty fields, unmoving. She didn't hear him approach, or maybe she did and didn't care. He stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. The wind blew her hair gently across her face. She didn't look at him, but after a while, her voice rose in a whisper so soft he thought he imagined it. "Noya." He turned his head slightly. "What was that?" She hugged the coat tighter. "My name," she said. "Noya." Elijah nodded slowly. "That's a good name." Silence returned, but it felt different now. Less like a wall, more like a fragile bridge stretched between them. That day, she followed him to the barn. He didn't ask her to, didn't speak at all. She simply walked behind him, like a stray pup, silent, watching. He opened the stall and started brushing down the mare. Noya lingered near the fence. After a few minutes, she stepped forward. He handed her the brush without a word. She hesitated, then took it. She brushed slowly, rhythmically, her fingers stiff but careful. The mare shifted and snorted, but didn't shy away. Elijah worked on the other side, occasionally glancing her way, but never interrupting. When they finished, Noya stood back, dusted off her hands, and looked at him. "You have another?" He paused. "Brush?" She nodded. He handed her one from the hook, and she went to the next stall. From that moment on, she followed him each morning. Not closely, not like a child seeking attention, but like someone trying to learn the language of the land. She watched how he patched fence posts, how he fed the chickens, how he sharpened tools. She didn't speak unless spoken to, but when she did, her words were clear, precise, heavy with effort. By the end of the week, she was sleeping in the smaller room without locking the door. One morning, Elijah woke to the sound of humming. He sat up slowly, unsure if he was dreaming. The sound came from outside. He walked to the porch and saw her crouched in the dirt, drawing symbols with a stick. They were circular, spiraled, almost like sunbursts with smaller lines breaking outward. "What's that mean?" he asked. She looked up, startled, then pointed to the sky. "Prayer," she said. "For help." He didn't ask from who. That night, as Elijah prepared supper, he noticed Noya watching him more intently than usual. Her eyes lingered on the knife in his hand, then on his scars. She studied him not with fear, but with curiosity. "You were in the war?" she asked. He paused. "Yeah. Long time ago." "You lose people?" He nodded. She looked down. "Me too." They ate in silence after that, but it was no longer an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that lives between people who know pain. The next day, she helped him repair a section of the outer fence. While hammering in a nail, she stopped suddenly and turned her head. Her whole body stiffened. "What is it?" Elijah asked. She didn't answer at first. Then she whispered, "Someone's been here." He stood up straight, scanning the ridge. Nothing moved, but he trusted her instinct. She walked over to the base of a fence post and pointed. Faint footprints, too large for hers, too fresh for his. He felt the old chill crawl up his spine. That night, he double-checked the doors and loaded the shotgun. Noya said nothing, but she didn't sleep in her room either. She curled up on the old couch, facing the door, Elijah in the chair beside her. Outside, the coyotes were silent. The following morning, Noya didn't hum, she didn't draw. She spent the day moving from window to window, peering into the distance. Elijah saddled the horse and rode to town, leaving her with the rifle and a promise to return before sundown. In town, he asked around quietly. At the general store, an old man named Garvey muttered something about a traveling gang passing through 2 weeks back. Rough men, half drunk, buying supplies and asking questions about the Indian territories. Elijah felt the noose tighten. When he got home, the door was locked, the windows covered. He knocked once. A pause. Then it opened slowly, Noya's face appearing in the crack, holding the rifle tight to her chest. He exhaled. "Good girl!" She let him in, and for the first time, he reached out and touched her shoulder. She didn't flinch. That night, after supper, Noya sat at the table, staring at the flames in the hearth. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "They took me from my uncle. He traded me for whiskey." Elijah didn't speak. "They said I was worthless, but maybe someone would want me if I was—" She touched her forehead, her voice breaking. "If I looked like a prize." He clenched his fists under the table. "They beat me, starved me. When I cried, they said I wasn't worth the rope they used, so they hung me from that tree." She looked up at him. "But you cut me down." Elijah didn't know what to say. Words were small things for big pain. "I'm not going back," she said. "You're not," he replied. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, and outside the wind rose once again across the empty fields. This time, he was not the only one listening. The wind had changed. It wasn't the kind of change you noticed with your eyes or ears, but Elijah felt it. It carried something sharp, like the edge of a blade against skin, unseen but undeniable. The air was dry, brittle, and every creak of the old boards in his house made his hand move, just a little closer to the rifle near the door. Something was coming. He didn't know what, but he'd lived long enough in silence to recognize when it broke wrong. Noya felt it too. She no longer hummed in the morning. She didn't draw her spirals in the dirt or ask about the animals. Her face had grown harder in the past few days, her voice flatter. She watched the tree line more than she watched the sky. Each time Elijah stepped outside, she followed him with her eyes until he disappeared from sight. And when he returned, she met him at the door with the rifle clutched to her chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. One morning before sunrise, Elijah rode into town alone. Noya insisted on staying back. She told him she could handle herself. He didn't like it, but he didn't argue. He saddled the mare and left her with 2 rifles, a pistol, and clear instructions. "Lock the door. Don't answer to anyone but him. If someone tried to break in, shoot first. Then shoot again." The ride into town was uneventful. The dirt road coiled between low hills, the dry grass brushing against his boots. By the time he hit the outskirts, the sun had begun to rise, bleeding pink over the rooftops. He stopped at the general store to buy salt and nails. Garvey, the old man who ran it, leaned over the counter with a wary look. "You hear about them boys passed through a week ago?" Garvey asked, lowering his voice. "What boys?" Elijah asked without turning. "Outsiders. Rough kind. Couple had tattoos. Snakes, I think. Real mean looks about them. Bought liquor, ammo, and rope. One asked if there was any place around here where a man could, quote, drop off cargo without too many questions." Elijah's grip tightened on the sack of flour. "Which way they go?" "Southwest, toward the bluffs. But they could have doubled back. You expecting trouble?" Elijah didn't answer. He gathered his goods, paid in silence, and mounted up. By the time he reached the ranch again, the sun was high and the wind had picked up. Noya stood on the porch. She hadn't moved from that spot. As he dismounted, she met his eyes. "They came close." His stomach dropped. "How close?" "I saw one man, on the ridge above the creek. Just one." He looked down here, then rode off. Elijah moved past her and went straight inside. He set the supplies on the counter, loaded every rifle, and reinforced the windows with boards. He checked the back door, then the cellar. Noya followed him room to room, saying nothing, just watching. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did she. They sat at the table, oil lamp flickering between them, shadows crawling along the walls. The silence was thick, heavier than the night. "Why do they want you?" he finally asked. She didn't answer at first. Then she looked down at her hands, fingers spread flat on the table. "Because I lived. They don't like that." He nodded slowly. It was the kind of answer that held a deeper truth, one that didn't need more words. Over the next few days, Elijah taught her how to shoot with accuracy. She was already a fast learner, but he made her faster. Tighter grip, steadier breath, sharper eye. Every evening they practiced until the sun slipped behind the hills. She never complained. She didn't flinch at the recoil. She hit every target. She had something to prove. Not to him, not to the world, but to herself. She wouldn't be helpless again. He taught her to lay traps, noise wires, trip lines, and signals using tin cans and dry twigs. They walked the property, setting up lookout points, escape routes, fallback positions. Elijah explained how to use the terrain, where to hide, how to strike. She memorized it all. They moved like soldiers, not ranchers. That Sunday, while checking the northern fence line, Elijah found something that made his blood run cold. A carcass. One of his missing cows. Slaughtered clean, guts removed, but not for food. Its flank had been branded with the same words that had been cut into Noya's forehead. For sell. He burned the carcass without telling her. He didn't want her to see it, but she already knew. That night she wouldn't come inside. She stood by the barn with the shotgun in her hands, scanning the dark. "They're close," she whispered. "I know." 2 nights later it happened. The ranch went quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that screamed. Elijah sat by the door, boots unlaced but ready, eyes locked on the window. Noya was upstairs, lying with her ear against the floorboards, listening for the smallest tremor. At midnight, the dog barked. Elijah bolted up and ran outside, rifle raised. But the dog didn't bark again. He found it lying dead near the gate. No blood. Neck snapped. He knelt beside it, touched the fur, still warm. They were here. He moved fast, locked the barn, double-bolted the door, and lit no lights. Upstairs, Noya slid the window open and positioned herself with the long rifle across the sill. Elijah took the ground floor. The wind moved the trees, but nothing else stirred, until he heard it, a twig snapping, then boots crunching on gravel. Shadows flickering at the edge of the property. 5, maybe 6 men. He counted at least 3 with rifles. A voice rose from the dark. "We don't want trouble, rancher," it called. "Just give us the girl and we'll be on our way." Elijah didn't answer. "You're not her daddy. She ain't yours. And she sure as hell don't belong in your house. You give her up and we'll leave you breathing." Elijah stood behind the front window, finger on the trigger. Another voice called out. "We know what she is. We know where she come from. You think this ends with you hiding her out here? You think anyone's going to care what happens to a little half-breed when we're done with her?" From upstairs, Elijah heard a click. Noya's finger tightened on the trigger. Then Elijah spoke. "She ain't going anywhere." A pause. "Suit yourself." Gunfire erupted. The first shot shattered the porch lantern, sending shards across the floor. Elijah ducked low and returned fire. Bullets punched into the walls, peppered the windows. Noya's rifle cracked once, twice, and one of the shadows dropped. Elijah moved room to room, firing from different windows, keeping their attackers from knowing where he'd be next. Noya held the high ground, picking them off when they exposed themselves. One of the men rushed the door. Elijah shot him through the chest. The body crumpled into the dirt. Then silence. Smoke drifted in the still night air. Elijah breathed heavily, sweat stinging his eyes. He didn't lower his weapon. Then he heard footsteps behind the barn. He raced outside, flanking wide through the darkness. He saw a figure, broad-shouldered, long coat, shotgun in hand, creeping toward the back window. Elijah raised his rifle, but the man turned fast and fired. The blast struck Elijah in the side. He staggered backward, dropped to one knee, and aimed. His shot went wide. The man approached, slow and confident. His face came into view in the moonlight, tattooed, scarred, grinning. "Should have stayed quiet, old man." He lifted the shotgun again. A gunshot rang out, but not from Elijah's rifle. The man jerked backward, a hole in his throat, and collapsed. Noya stood behind him, panting, the pistol trembling in her hands. Elijah collapsed against the barn wall, blood spreading across his side. She ran to him, tears streaking down her face. "You're okay," she whispered. "You have to be okay." He looked up at her, eyes glazed with pain. "You did good, girl," he said. "Real good." Then he passed out. Noya dragged him inside, barricaded the doors, and sat by his side until the first light of dawn broke over the hills. Outside, the vultures circled again. But this time, it wasn't over the ranch. It was over the men who didn't make it back. The world returned in fragments. Pain came first, sharp and hot, pulsing just beneath Elijah's ribs like a living flame. Then came the taste of copper in his mouth, thick and bitter. Light followed, searing behind closed lids. Somewhere nearby, wood creaked, water dripped, and someone breathed in tight, careful rhythm. He opened his eyes slowly. Noya was asleep beside him in the chair, her head resting on the mattress, fingers still wrapped around his hand. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes swollen from lack of rest. The window behind her showed a gray morning sky, clouded and heavy. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. His breath caught. She stirred instantly, blinking awake. When her eyes met his, something broke inside her. Relief, fear, and exhaustion collapsed into one soundless gasp as she sat up straighter and brushed his forehead gently with the back of her hand. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Elijah swallowed with difficulty. "How long?" "3 days," she said. "You had fever. I couldn't. I thought you—" He squeezed her hand. "You did good." She nodded, biting her lip, holding back the tears she hadn't let herself cry. He drifted in and out for the next 2 days, sometimes waking to find her changing the bandage, sometimes hearing the soft scraping of a chair as she moved around the house. She fed him broth, cleaned his wounds, checked the door locks a dozen times a day. The rifle never left her side. Each time he woke, the bruises under her eyes looked darker. He tried to sit up on the 4th morning. Pain lanced through his side, but he managed to prop himself against the headboard. Noya rushed in, surprised to find him conscious and upright. "I'll make you tea," she said quickly. "I'll take coffee," he muttered, forcing a smile. She shook her head. "Doctor said no. I didn't see no doctor." "I rode into town after I stopped the bleeding," she said. "I told the doc you'd been gored by a bull. He came that night. You were burning up." Elijah's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at her. Really looked. "You rode into town alone?" She nodded. "Borrowed your old gelding. He's slow, but he moves. That's a day's ride." "I didn't sleep till I got back." He stared at her, pride and shame tangled in his chest. She was a child, barely 15, and she had faced down death, ridden alone through a desert, lied to a doctor, and kept him alive. "Hell of a girl," he said. Noya didn't smile. Her eyes moved to the window. "They're not all gone," she said. "Some got away. I saw tracks near the ridge 2 days ago. They're watching us, waiting." He felt it too. That sick churn in his gut hadn't left since the night they were attacked. "They'll come back," she whispered. "With more." He nodded grimly. "Then we make ready." His recovery was slow, but each day he walked a little farther, stood a little longer. Noya helped him dress, helped him eat, helped him strap his side when he tried to lift anything heavier than a hammer. Together, they buried the bodies. 6 graves in the soft earth behind the barn. Noya carved no names. Elijah didn't ask for them. They were not men who deserved to be remembered. At night, they slept in shifts. Elijah took the window overlooking the hills. Noya covered the back door with a rifle in her lap. They left no lanterns burning, no fires in the hearth, just silence and watchful breath. The town had questions. Sheriff Daniels rode out 2 days after the doctor returned, hat low, eyes sharp. "You sure you were gored by a bull?" he asked Elijah, who was leaning on a crutch near the corral. "Bull with a mean left hook," Elijah replied. The sheriff squinted. "You see any strangers lately?" "Some passed through a while back, didn't stop here." "You'd tell me if you saw anything else, wouldn't you?" Elijah met his gaze without blinking. "You'd be the first." Daniels hesitated, then nodded once. "All right, then. But you watch yourself, Cain. Things been stirring lately. Not good things." When the sheriff rode off, Noya stepped out from the barn, where she'd been hidden with a rifle aimed at the lawman's chest. Elijah sighed. "You are ready to shoot him?" "If he tried to take you, yes." He didn't correct her. That evening, Elijah unfolded a map across the table. Noya stood beside him, hair tied back, face leaner than before. She traced the canyons with her finger. "I know this land," she said. "There's a way to the south, between the rocks, a narrow pass. They'll come that way if they think you're weak." "We can't defend both sides," Elijah murmured. "Then we don't. We lead them where we want." Over the next week, they built traps, pits, snares, smoke bombs, wire triggers. They scattered empty rifles where they could grab them. They buried caches of ammunition in the fields. Elijah taught her how to signal silently, with mirrors, with hand gestures, with the sound of birds. Noya showed him how to track by scent, how to listen for the weight of boots on dry leaves. They became a unit, a small army of two. Then the letter came. Noya found it nailed to the barn door, a bloodied feather pinned above it. The handwriting was jagged and cruel. "You can keep the girl, but it'll cost you. We're coming. And this time, we bring fire." Elijah burned the letter in the stove. The night before the next storm, they heard the first howl. Coyotes at first, then a whistle, long, low, and human. Elijah cocked his shotgun and moved to the porch. Noya crouched on the roof, bow in hand. Neither spoke. The wind kicked up dust. Thunder rolled in the far distance. Then they saw them. Figures in the dark. 8, maybe 10. One held a torch. Another carried a chain. Elijah felt his pulse slow. "Noya," he said without turning. "Remember the escape route?" She nodded from above. "If I fall, you run. You hear me?" "No. That's an order." "I don't take orders." He allowed a small, bitter grin. "Fine." The torchlight came closer. The leader stepped into view. He was tall, lean, wearing a long coat the color of dried blood. His face was scarred across one eye, and his teeth were too white when he smiled. "You Cain?" he called. "Depends. I'm here for the girl. Ain't worth much to me now, but it's principle. You don't get to steal from us and walk away. She ain't yours. She was sold fair. She ain't for sale. You really want to die for an Apache?" Elijah stepped forward, shoulders square. "No," he said, "but I'll sure as hell kill for one." The man's smile faded. "Then, so be it." The first shot came from Noya. It took the torchbearer clean through the neck. The flame hit the ground and sputtered in the dirt. Chaos erupted. Elijah fired both barrels, dropping 2 men in a heartbeat. Noya moved like wind, arrows singing, each one striking true. The rest scattered, returning fire, but they were disoriented, shouting, blinded by darkness and dust. The traps worked. 2 fell into pits. Another tripped a line and took a blast of birdshot to the face. Smoke bombs choked the air. The attackers screamed, shooting blindly. Elijah reloaded with practiced speed. His side burned, vision swimming, but he held the line. One man charged the door. Noya dropped from the roof and drove a blade into his throat. Elijah saw the leader vanish into the smoke, heading for the back. "Noya, he's behind." She nodded and sprinted into the shadows. Elijah staggered toward the barn, pain threatening to black out his vision. Gunfire crackled behind him. Then, a scream. He reached the corner just in time to see Noya on the ground, the man above her, fist raised. Elijah roared and fired. The shot missed. The man turned, rage in his eyes, but Noya wasn't done. She jammed the blade upward with both hands, straight into his ribs. The man froze, coughed once, and collapsed beside her. It was over. The survivors fled. The bodies lay still. Elijah dropped to his knees beside her. She was covered in blood, shaking. "I'm okay," she whispered. He looked her over, found no wounds that weren't from others. "You saved me," he said. She looked into his eyes. "You saved me first." He pulled her into his arms, held her tightly, and for the first time in years, Elijah Kane wept. Not for loss, but for what had been found. The wind was different now. It no longer carried fear. It brought stillness, the kind that follows a storm when nothing dares to move, as if the earth itself holds its breath. Smoke had long since faded from the battle at the ranch. The graves were fresh again, but this time they were fewer. Most of the men who attacked didn't get buried. Elijah had tossed their corpses into a ravine with no ceremony. Men like that didn't deserve rest. In the days that followed, the land seemed to remember how to breathe. The horses grazed without spooking. The birds returned to the trees. But inside the ranch house, Elijah still moved like a man walking through the memory of a fire. He limped on his bad leg, his bandages tight, his side healing slower than he liked. But it wasn't pain that slowed him. It was change. And change, Elijah knew, was heavier than any wound. Noya moved through the house as if she'd always belonged there. She swept the floors, hauled water, and tended the animals without being asked. She never waited for instruction. She simply did. And Elijah, for the first time in years, allowed someone to move freely in his world. At first it was uncomfortable, then it became normal, and soon it became necessary. He found himself watching her from the porch each evening, as she sat by the garden with a rifle always within reach, her back straight, her eyes on the horizon. She no longer looked like a child rescued. She looked like someone who'd survived fire and had decided never to burn again. On the 7th evening after the attack, a rider appeared on the trail. Elijah saw him first, a lone figure kicking up dust as he approached from the north. He tensed, fingers wrapping around his shotgun. Noya emerged from the barn with the rifle already slung across her shoulder. The rider wore a wide hat and a coat patched at the shoulders. His horse was lean, his posture easy, not a threat at first glance. But Elijah had learned long ago that men with easy postures sometimes carried the deadliest intentions. The rider stopped at the gate, dismounted, and held up his hands. "Name's Marshal Ethan Hale," he called. "Out of San Miguel." Elijah exchanged a glance with Noya, then stepped forward. "You lost, Marshal?" "No, sir. I'm here on business." "You federal?" "State. Hired to track a gang of traffickers moving girls through Apache lands. Been following them since spring." Elijah said nothing. "I heard rumors out this way," Hale continued, "about a rancher who stood his ground, a girl with snake scars. Wanted to see for myself." Noya stepped forward then, her chin lifted. "They're dead," she said flatly. The marshal looked at her and nodded. "So I've heard. Found what was left of them 4 miles back in a draw. Buzzards don't leave much." Elijah didn't lower his guard. "You come to arrest somebody?" "No, sir. Just here to witness. And maybe report the truth." Noya narrowed her eyes. "What truth?" "That a man and a girl buried a sickness in this desert. That justice don't always ride in with a badge. Sometimes it looks like an old man and a brave soul who wouldn't be bought or broken." She looked away, unconvinced. The marshal reached into his saddlebag slowly and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a writ. Declaration of self-defense signed by Sheriff Daniels. You're clear. No one's looking to hang you, Mr. Kane." Elijah took the paper without reading it. "Don't mean much." "It should," Hale said. "Truth matters, even if no one listens." He remounted, tipped his hat, and turned back the way he came. He never asked to stay the night. Elijah respected that. When the dust from his trail had settled, Noya turned to Elijah. "Will it ever be over?" He looked out at the hills, the same way he had every day for years. "It's never over," he said, "but it changes." Spring arrived with hard rains and green shoots pushing up from the dust. The ranch came back to life in ways Elijah had almost forgotten. The henhouse produced eggs again, the dry creek bed ran with water, and the air smelled sweet after the storms, not like ash and blood. One morning, Noya stood in the field, her hair braided back, a notebook in one hand. Elijah approached with curiosity. "You writing?" She nodded. "What for?" "I want to remember it right," she said. "Not like a story someone else tells." He smiled slightly. "Then you write it down. Every word. Every scar." That summer, Elijah walked into town for the first time without wearing a gun on his hip. People still stared, still called him the ghost rancher behind his back, but they did so with caution now. With respect. Noya came with him. She wore a dress stitched by hand, plain but clean. Her boots were worn but strong. She stood beside Elijah in the general store, in the blacksmith's yard, in the post office. No one dared speak against her. The town changed that day. Maybe just a little, but enough. By autumn, Elijah had turned part of the barn into a schoolroom. Noya insisted. She sent word to the tribe she once belonged to, and, slowly, other children came, some Apache, some white, some orphaned, some abandoned. They learned letters from Noya and how to shoe a horse from Elijah. They learned to speak both English and Apache, to track deer and read maps. And they learned how to hold a rifle without fear. How to stand their ground when the world tried to sell them short. One night, long after the children had gone home, Elijah sat on the porch as Noya swept dust from the schoolroom steps. "You did that," he said. She looked up. "We did." He tilted his head. "You ever think about going back to your people?" "I thought about it," she said. "But they're not the only ones who need someone. You belong wherever you want." "I know." The silence between them was full again, but not with fear or grief. It was full of peace. In the winter that followed, Elijah grew slower. His legs stiffened more in the cold. He slept longer. One morning he didn't rise with the sun. Noya found him in his bed, awake but staring at the ceiling. "You ready for breakfast?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, just thinking." "About what?" "About what it means to leave something behind." She sat on the edge of the bed. "You already did." He nodded. "Guess I did." He reached out and took her hand. "You're my daughter," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "I know," she whispered, "and you're my father." He smiled then, a soft, tired smile. And for the first time in all his years, Elijah Kane closed his eyes, not to escape pain, but to rest in peace. The school became a home, a sanctuary, a place where no child would ever be marked for sale again. And when the wind moved across the hills, it carried not the sound of silence, but the sound of laughter, of healing, and of a name carried on the breath of the land. Noya, the girl who lived, the girl who fought, the girl who found her voice and gave it to others. In the unforgiving heart of the Wild West, where cruelty often spoke louder than justice, one old rancher and a girl marked for sale rewrote what family truly means. Through blood, silence, and rising from ruin, they proved that love doesn't need to be born. It can be built. And sometimes, the fiercest warriors are the ones who simply refuse to be broken. If this story moved you, there's more where that came from. Saddle up and ride with us through tales of untamed courage, unlikely love, and redemption in the harshest frontiers. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Chronicles, where every story reminds us that even in the dustiest corners of the West, hearts still beat with hope. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and join the ride.